Your Honor, Nisa Bula from Fiji. I was born in the Vanua, so I extend the spirit of the Vanua to you. Suva is one of the great cities of Oceania, as is Papeete, so it's a wonderful feeling to be in a context that means a lot to me. It's the context of Oceania. First, I'd like to thank Professor Peter Brown and his team, you know who you are, for inviting me to this conference. We don't know each other, so that's quite remarkable, because I feel as if maybe my work appealed to them at some point, which is always the best reason to be invited. I'm going to speak in a minority language. It's not very often that English is a minority language in any context, but here it is, which is rather nice. I speak in another language which is a minority language within a minority language, which is Fiji Bhasha. Very few of us in Fiji speak that particular language, which came out of the plantation experience. And it's a pretty political language in its own way, full of ironies of the indenture experience. So I'm going to try to pace myself so that people who, in fact, don't have a good grasp of the English language have access to what I'm trying to say. My title is The Enigma of Poetry. But first, a deep bow to the Atua, the spirit of Ipeli Hau'ofa. When Hau'ofa pointed out that the people of Oceania did not see small islands in the sea, but rather a large sea of islands, he achieved two objectives. He shattered the bounded, land-oriented perspective espoused by the apologists of surplus accumulation as manifested in the progress-addicted nation-state. More critically, however, he exchanged a belittling cliche for an unbounded metaphor. The narrowly denotative for the expansively connotative. Our Sea of Islands puts the sea first, because islands emerge from the waters that surround them. The ocean's connection to islands is horizontal as well as vertical. The sea's visible surface stands for the horizontal, whilst that which lies beneath the surface marks the vertical and invisible relationship. It is at this point that Hau'ofa's metaphor turns an interactive trope into an enigmatic one. The sea is the medium that interactively binds together islands and islanders, but it remains a conundrum when regarded vertically. For below the surface, the ocean is an enigma, in that it never shows itself completely. It is an unplumbed profundity. And this quote I take from Bloom, who is thinking about the sea in James Joyce's Ulysses. By virtue of a philosophical fillip, Hau'ofa stumbles upon the Atua of poetry. So, a poem, when it aspires to poetry, constitutes an enigma. It speaks to us as a rebus might, but one devoid of a key. Sigmund Freud thought of the rebus as a pictorial puzzle, almost cubistic in its implications. It scrambles, condenses, and over-determines signification at one and the same time. He related the rebus to dreams. We could express this as a paradoxical axiom with the same outcome. A poem is an enigma with multiple keys, none of which quite fit. I said in an interview that poetry is simply the place where language mutinies against its own condition of exhaustion. Every poem worth its name smuggles into its corpus a language that is also an anti-language, obtusely resistant to acts of mediation and signification. The cipher, in this instance, cannot be deciphered. The poem, qua poem, is an event, a happening, where the witness cannot attest to the exact status of what is happening. Lest we plunge into an impenetrable abyss, let me cast an eye on the Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. While that's happening, it's a short poem, so maybe I'll read it to you whilst they put it up on the screen. And this poem is The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams, who's an American poet. I wanted to show you this poem because I wanted to illustrate the theory behind my idea that poetry is really enigma. That's the poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. Speaking of chickens, I noticed that Papeete has a remarkable tolerance for free-ranging chickens. One even crossed the road to leave me pondering over an ancient but puzzling question. Why did a chicken cross the road? In any case, that title serves as a promissory note to the reader. It's called The Red Wheelbarrow. The first enigma, then, is the breaking of the pledge contained in the definite article of the poem's title by the indefinite article of the red wheelbarrow featured in the body of the text. The singularity of the titular wheelbarrow dissolves into the generality of a red wheelbarrow. Any red wheelbarrow, that is to say, all imagistic generalities may forge a metonymic relationship with the imagistic singularity of the red wheelbarrow. Our red wheelbarrow is a metonym for the red wheelbarrow, for its distinctive, singular, and ungraspable form. Hence, the oblique homage to Plato. The second enigma entails a provisional act of deletion. Let me vandalize the poem by omitting the first verse. So cancel the first verse, so much it depends upon. Without the first two lines, the poem turns into a pictorial complex consisting of three juxtaposed images. One, a red wheelbarrow. Two, coated with rainwater. Three, next to the white chickens. The colorful, painterly contrast between red and white is self-evident, but the penultimate stanza also plays on notions of wetness and reflected light. Without the inaugural stanza, however, the poem captures an inert image where the intellectual content lacks emotional or philosophical depth. Ezra Pound's understanding of the image is that it presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. The moment we restore the first stanza to its proper place, we invest the image with an emotional and philosophical dimension. We also convert it into an enigma where none of the keys quite fit. If so much depends on the three stanzas that make up the poem's image, we wonder at the conundrum presented to us by the uncountable determiner. What precisely is this elusive so much that depends upon the image of a rained-on red wheelbarrow beside the white chickens? It is not possible to quantify the determiner because the muchness is inexhaustible as well as teasingly obscured. All acts of deciphering the poem fail because of the puzzling surplus of so much. What is this so much? One might argue that the poem is tellingly self-reflexive, since it is utterly dependent on the image, or that so much itself hangs, which is the root meaning of depend, upon the three stanzas of imagery. Even so, no reading, whether denotative or connotative, offers a route out of the overdetermined riddle of the poem. Jacques Derrida makes a kindred point in another context, and this is what he says. There is no literature without a suspended relation to meaning and reference. Suspended means suspense, but also dependence, conditionality. In its suspended condition, literature can only exceed itself. And this is the point I'm getting to, that it cannot be, in fact, pinned down to politics or anything else. It's always exceeding whatever it is we're trying to pin it down with. Robert Frost's statement that poetry is what is lost in translation is pertinent in this respect, as it testifies to poetics' enigmatic occultism. W.H. Auden has a kindred idea in mind when he asserts that poetry survives in the valley of its saying, sequestered from all that surrounds it. It follows that the enigma of poetry is pivotal to my thinking about its relevance to politics. Whenever there is an exchange of science in any kind of performance, values enter into circulation. There is an uneven dispersal of sign values in all acts of communication. Women know this. Politics, which is simply another name for power, is always present in the uneven distribution of sign values, precisely because sign values withhold, negate, or assign power. So, if politics is concerned with power, power is embedded in knowledge, and knowledge, as Michel Foucault writes, is a function of discourse. Discourse invariably shows up through the distribution and redistribution of sign values in language. Language is therefore implicated in structures of power. But propaganda is the crudest example of language deployed as an instrument of mass persuasion. There is no enigma in the work of propaganda. Doubtless poetry is riddled with politics, as it is composed of fluctuating sign values in the issuing forth of the singular text. Jacques Derrida notes that the singularity of a sign concerns the potential iteration of the counter signature, and he says this over and over again in many of his works. All acts of writing and reading bring forth textual singularities via deferential repetition. As a keyless enigma, however, the poetic text is intolerant of propaganda. Poetry sides with itself and is, I dare say, on its own side. For the rest of this paper, I shall discuss two texts from Oceania that are generative of a politics attesting to poetry's enigmatic status. The first is Ruparake Patea's Kidnap, and Ruparake visited Tahiti many years back, and Albert Wendt's In Your Enigma. The first poem takes, and I'm just going to move this. The first poem takes as its thematic subject the introduction of formal education in the aftermath of colonial modernity, and Patea is thinking of Samoa in this context. Ideology, as Louis Althusser has pointed out, always exists in an apparatus and its practice or practices, and formal education is clearly an ideological state apparatus, which is why we're sitting here in the room. It is also an industrial complex, generative of surplus value. The university as a factory, right? Yeah. Formal education turns into an extended metaphor, attesting to the construction of a subject position that adheres to some undeclared but normative Western model. The poem's enigma hinges on the speaker's inability to articulate an indigenous worldview while describing an education system and his experiences therein in the language of the colonizer, in English in this instance. Kidnapped is an intriguing poem because it recounts the disappearance of an indigenous subject over the course of 15 years. And this is what it says. One day I was kidnapped by a band of Western philosophers, armed with glossy picture textbooks and registered reputations, holder of BA and MA degrees. I was held in a classroom guarded by Churchill and Garibaldi, pinned up on one wall, and Hitler and Mao dictating from the other. Guevara pointed a revolution at my brains from his each 3-month term. They sent threats to my mama and papa. Mama and papa loved their son and paid ransom fees each time. Each time, mama and papa grew poorer and poorer, and my kidnappers grew richer and richer. I grew whiter and whiter. On my release 15 years after, I was handed, among loud applause from fellow victims, a piece of paper to decorate my walls certifying my release. So basically, education system kidnaps this persona. That's what is being said in the poem. The poem attempts to depict the fractured and contradictory subject position of the ex-colonized. To grasp this subject position entails an alertness to the play of alienation and identification constitutive of post-colonial life forms. Kidnapped is ambivalent precisely because an expressed disavowal of an alienating system is only possible through the irony of avowal. The persona declares that due to his mother's carelessness, he was kidnapped by a band of Western philosophers who for years extracted a ransom from his parents, in which time he grew whiter and whiter until finally he was handed a piece of paper certifying my release. It chronicles the wars waged in pursuit of political modernity by Garibaldi, Italian, Hitler, Churchill, Mao, and Guevara, my hero in the age of surplus accumulation as managed by the bounded nation state. The speaker's liberation from the state apparatus of Western education poses an enigma. We may frame this as a question. What comes after the certification of release if the persona is the translated subject of political modernity in the time of surplus accumulation? The detention complex of the education system and its imported epistemic structures gives shape to the kidnapped subject. That much is clear. In a variant strain of the Stockholm syndrome, this subject is able to express his dissent only through the paradoxical dynamic of identification with the imported episteme, as well as estrangement from it in the ironized and yet stubbornly meaningful silence of the indigenous episteme. The certification of release is tantamount to the colonization of the mind. It involves, as Albert Wendt noted in 1976, the whitification of the colonized by a colonial education system. The irony acknowledges the double bind in the loaded silence of the indigenous episteme. But the poem is unable to liberate itself from a compulsive hybridity in its recourse to free verse, to colloquialism, to irony, and to direct political allusion. The poem announces its modernist genealogy whilst positioning itself as a post-colonial rejoinder to that genealogy vis-a-vis an imported education system. The poem alludes to that which forever withholds its name, the life world of the vanished indigenous subject. In sum, it says what it cannot possibly say, and that silence lies at the heart of its grim enigma. So basically, that move is to stretch the English language to the point at which it falls silent because it cannot speak on behalf of the indigenous subject. Although he avoids Pater's recourse to irony, Wendt's approach in the poem that follows is self-consciously alert to the overdetermined conundrum that is poetry. And this is, this is Wendt, the other was Ruperake, so it got mixed over. So the poem is by Albert Wendt. And it's for Raina, which is not there. Let's see if it's somewhere else. No. It's dedicated to Raina, and this is how it goes. You are dressed in your enigma, you shift like mist across words that describe water, you plant signs, you invent yourself in syllables of night light and winter turning spring on Maunga Fowl's shoulders. Everything is everything is earth, the Atua feed on, everything is earth, molded in Ruamoko's belly and thrown up to know Tane's kiss of living air. Your ancestors left shadows for you to grow into. They fished islands and visions out of tides that washed back into the void. They dealt in imagery of bone and feather. They knew the alphabet of omens and could cipher the silences that once knew the speech of pain. They planted white pebbles in the mouths of the dead and sailed them into the eyes of the future. You are dressed in your enigma that finds language in the gift that is water, that is earth, that is everything. Composed in the second person and in the free verse form, the poem appears to address the woman of the dedication, Raina, named in the dedication. It is possible that the woman is an enduring mystery to the persona, hence the title. Still, what does it really mean to be dressed in an enigma, arrayed in a riddle or a rebus? The increasing self-reflexivity of the opening stanza suggests that the woman might not be a stable addressee at all. It is clear that the first line puns on are dressed to mean addressed. You are dressed, and therefore you are dressed. In other words, it wants the reader to address the enigma of the addressee whose identity remains undisclosed. The self-referential allusions to language point to another possibility vis-a-vis the addressee. Does the ode speak to itself in riddles, in the very act of invention or composition? The etymological root of describe is to write or to inscribe. It follows that language inscribes water across which the addressee shifts like mist or like a textual ghost conjured up by the sign system. The poem continues to draw attention to its self-referential dimensions in the third stanza by referring to the imagery of bone and further the alphabet of omens and the ancestors' ability to cipher the silences that once knew the speech of pain. Poetry, in short, is an enigma dressed and addressed in words, syllables, and signs. It's dressed in language and it's addressed in it as well. It plants signs and invents itself in syllables of differentiated stresses and sounds, and that's how poetry works. As it turns out, the second enigma generates a third. We plow deeper into the poem. The text includes 4 nouns from the Maori language. One is a common noun, atua, which I think is shared around the Pacific. It's also a Samoan noun. And the rest are proper names, Mangafao, Ruaumoko, and Tane. Embedded within the poem are coded or cryptic signs that obstruct, even rebuff, the signifying chain of an imposed language system. The 4 Maori nouns resemble ciphered pebbles dropped into the lake of colonial English to create that ripple effect. They are strange by turning the ideologically familiar into the alluringly unfamiliar and strange. The resultant intersecting ripples generate an epistemic disturbance within the hegemonic language to the point that we suspect that the addressee is neither a woman nor the poem. So what is being said and to whom? Whence refusal to call Maungawhau by its colonial designation Mount Eden is overtly a political act. He resists paying homage to the Earl of Auckland, George Eden. For interred within the misnomer of Mount Eden is the enigma of Maungawhau. This volcanic mountain is not just a Maori landmark, it belongs to the category of 2 Puna Maunga, or ancestral mountains, attesting to genealogical, historical, civilizational, and spiritual ties binding together the 13 tribes, or iwi and hapu, that constitute the mana whenua of Tamaki, Makarao. The scoria cones represent the continuum of pre-content life forms including a relationship to the foul tree as expressed in the Maori noun. In Maori cosmology, the scoria cones are the creation of Mataho, who is the keeper of earthly secrets and the demigod of volcanoes. And it's wonderful to give this paper here because you can see all the remnants of volcanoes in Tahiti. If the enigma pertains to winter turning to spring on Mangafao's shoulders, it is possible to argue that the mountain is the poem's addressee. Further, given that Mataho is the keeper of planetary secrets, there is little possibility of any human finding the key to the poem. Slowly but surely, Wendt is disrupting the signifying chain of one system by introducing Maori nouns that admit us into the signifying fragments that capture an estranging worldview. Scoriae, after all, are composed of balsort fragments ejected from a volcano. Wendt's intentions are clearly political. The poet is acutely aware, and he has said as much, that one has to work through and beyond the legacy of colonialism in order to get to the epistemic fragments of indigenous life worlds. And this is what he says in a paper which is entitled Towards a New Oceania. I do not advocate a return to an imaginary Papalangi golden age or utopian womb. Physically, we are too corrupted for such a re-entry. Our quest should not be for a revival of our past cultures, but for the creation of new cultures, which are free of the taint of colonialism and based firmly on our own past. The quest should be for new Oceania. By virtue of their fragmentation, these life worlds retain an enigmatic status. The movement of the second stanza enacts a volcanic eruption, but the elusive references in the chant-like refrain indicate the prevalence of a Maori worldview. Declaring the simultaneous coexistence of all things, the first line prepares the ground for a reference to all existence being earth that nourishes the Atua, thus linking the geological and cosmological realms through a spiritual intermediary. The third line continues the imagery in the remark that everything is earth molded in Ruamoko's belly, a Maori deity with oversight over earthquakes and volcanoes and seasons. Ruamoko is brother to Mataho. The implication is that Ruamoko's erupting belly creates Mangafao. The fertility deity Tane, another kin, transforms the molten lava into forest and birds. Genealogically linked to Ranganui, Father Earth, and Papa Tuanuku, Mother Earth, Mataho, Ruamoko, and Tane are crucial figures in Maori cosmology. Sky, earth, geological events, and all beings, animal, human, and divine, constitute an inextricable assemblage. By plunging the reader into the rabbit hole of Maori cosmology, Wendt opens up the possibility of a contrapuntal reading of the poem, and that expression comes from Edward Said. Even though the last two stanzas are entirely in English, he appears to superimpose on the imposed language the epistemic structures and cadences of Polynesia. The upshot is that the addressee may be the Maori collectivity, or for that matter, any reader who is capable of empathizing with Maori life forms. Hybrid texts, as Homi Bhabha has demonstrated, are open to radical transformations in sign values through the dynamic work of ambivalence. Turnover in sign values work against hegemonic positions through a redistribution of power and authority. The third stanza alludes to the transmission of ancestral mana, to Polynesian creation narratives, to indigenous ritual practices, and to the capacity of the Maori to read the natural world as an omen engendering sign system. The imagery of white pebbles in the mouths of the dead directly references the ritualized passage of erudite knowledge from priests to people, from gods to men. Fed afatu, or pebble, the hue of lehu, white foam, the people swallows it upon the completion of a prayer that poetically invokes Polynesian divinities, including Io. Wendt's inversion of this practice, where the ancestors feed pebbles to their dead, testifies to the cyclical transfer of knowledge where the dead profit from the rite of passage as do the eyes of the future, a metaphor for unborn descendants. However, captures this concept in one succinct phrase or sentence. He says, since the past is alive in us, the dead are alive in us, we are our history. In conclusion, whereas Pater attests to the silence of an indigenous subject in a language symptomatic of the practices implicated in the silencing, Wet admits us into a fragmented Maori archive without aborting the idea that poetry is an enigma irreducible to politics. The line that refers to the ancestors' ability to cipher the silences that once knew the speech of pain keeps faith with the keyless riddle that is poetry. Cipher, on the one hand, is suggestive of encryption or the concealment of knowledge and meaning from the uninitiated. In its archaic verb form, however, it signifies the opposite, accessibility as well as visibility. To cipher, in short, is to decipher. To decipher, it follows, is to cipher. When we read poetry, are we ciphering or deciphering? Is enigma perhaps its own key and beyond politics? Maruru.